tackling unseen poetry. Here we have one of the past paper questions that SEA have outlined on their website for unseen poetry. This poem is called After the Titanic, and the poem is about the president of the company which owned the Titanic, and how he survived when the ship sank in 1912. So the question that you will get and the format it will take will be something along the lines of what I have in the little pink box. Write about the poem After the Titanic. You should describe what the poet writes about and how he uses language to convey the speaker's thoughts and feelings. So when you're faced with this poem, you will need to reread it and try and figure out what exactly it is actually about. Also make sure that you keep in mind that you describe language, and you also keep in mind speaker's thoughts and feelings, because these are going to be your question terms that you use and pepper throughout your essay. So if you look at After the Titanic, to summarise what it's actually about, the poem is about the president of the company which owned the Titanic. He survived after the ship sank, and the poem explores his guilt and mental debilitation after the event, exploring how the tragedy has impacted him. We are told that after he got away in a boat, he was humbled at the inquiry, where people seem to have made him feel guilty for his supposed crimes of surviving. He talks about how he sat shivering in the lifeboat. Then he talks of how he now locks himself away in a lonely house, using drugs, supposedly cocaine, and staying bedridden, refusing to accept visitors in an attempt to escape from his own mental anguish and survivor's guilt. When you're actually structuring this essay, you might want to use the following structure. So we'll look at it now. You might want to use summary and what it's about, analysis of title, form and structure including the narrative point of view, imagery and language, tone, theme, and then your own personal response. Okay? So if we look at the title is called, well, it's After the Titanic. So the title is helpful in revealing the poem's content. The title After the Titanic connotes this poem will be a reflective one, exploring the speaker's life after surviving the tragedy. Then if we look at how it looks on the page in terms of our form and structure, you can see that it takes the form of a single stanza. It is written in free verse. There is heavy use of enjambment or your run-on lines to emphasise the traumatised emotional state of the speaker. The poem is written from the first person point of view, and it is actually a soliloquy where he reveals his own thoughts and feelings. It starts in the past tense when he describes the escape from the Titanic after it sank, and switches to present tense when he's exploring his life after the event and how he feels now. The first person point of view really helps give us insight into the state of his tormented mind, as it fragments due to guilt, emphasising his inner thoughts and feelings. You'll notice that the sentences actually alternate between short and long, reflecting the waves in the sea that haunt him. There's a kind of natural feel to the rhythm that's helped through the use of enjambment and heavy use of caesura. And this depicts the speaker's utterances as sudden emotional outbursts, further revealing his inner torment. Then if we were to look at the imagery and language used, and you can flick back to the bit in the video and screenshot it to have a look at the poem, or you can find the poem on the SEA website. But if we look at the imagery and language used, we can see that this further reinforces his suffering and helps paint the speaker as a somewhat tragic figure. The verb choice humbled suggests that the inquiry was unjust and that he was made feel worthless and was blamed. This is furthered through the isolating pronoun they said. The poet uses metaphor in I sank to emphasise the speaker's despair. Despite surviving, he is now drowning in nightmare, sorrow and despair. The guilt and self-torment that he obviously feels is further emphasised through the depiction of the victims as heroes. The suffering he undergoes is emphasised through the violent verb bursting and shredded. His self-imposed isolation is obviously a result of guilt, and is shown through the adjective choice of lonely when he describes the house, which further adds to his characterisation as this paranoid individual who has undergone suffering at the hands of those who have judged him, and also a self-imposed suffering as a result of his guilt, often known as survivor's guilt. The speaker is depicted as a pathetic and pitiable man through the sibilant sat shivering, emphasising his physical suffering on the night of the event. There is vivid visual imagery of his mental and physical suffering through adjectival descriptions of dark water and ice. And there's also a pun or a play on words when the speaker states, "I turned to ice," as he depicts his physical suffering as a survivor and alludes to the iceberg that caused the ship to sink. Pathos or pity is generated for the speaker as a result of this, as his mental anguish and survivor's guilt are revealed. This is further reiterated through that simile, "heart breaks loose and rolls down like a stone," as we see he feels so guilty and filled with remorse that he is sinking into a pit of despair. We can see that he is depicted as paranoid, a very paranoid individual plagued by nightmares, shown through the oral imagery, AURAL imagery, and verb choice, thundering, and the alliteration and listing of pandemonium of prams, pianos, sideboards. And we see the speaker inundated with images of debris that reminds him of all those who perished. And also pandemonium is a metaphor for the chaos that would have existed as well in the state of the speaker's mind. Then we can see that this is furthered through the personification of the tide. So we find that the tide leaves broken toys and hat boxes at the speaker's doorstep to torture him with reminders of the women and children who died. His mental anguish and depression is further emphasised through the passing of time, as all being some sort of haze or blur. The showers of April, flowers of May mean nothing to me. So the internal rhyme of showers and flowers further emphasises this fragmented state of mind. And the tone could be described as hurt and anguished, as shown through the pitiable "I sank." This also helps reveal a helpless tone of a bleak and tragic figure. A paranoid tone is used in the lines, "When my gardener describes to strangers how the old man stays in bed." This suggests that our speaker feels everyone is against him, judging him for his survival whilst others died. And then finally, a resigned tone is used at the end of the plea, "Include me in your lamentations," as the speaker suggests that he is also a victim just like those who died, and whilst he may have survived, he has metaphorically died because mentally his suffering is just too great. The poem explores the theme of guilt, personal anguish, and the torment of the individual. It focuses strongly on the idea of survivor's guilt and the speaker's depressed state of mind after such a tragic event. And we can see the speaker feels paranoid, seeing symbols of guilt plaguing him in his everyday life. He feels pain and undergoes tremendous suffering when the wind blows from the sea, reminding him of the tragedy no matter where he turns. He feels helpless and like he cannot face people, feeling that everyone is talking about him because he overheard the gardener tell people that he stays in bed and uses cocaine to ease his burden. Nightmares seem to plague him when he sleeps at night, and the theme of suffering is also explored through the hurt and pain he evidently feels through asking the mourners to grieve for him along with the drowned victims. His plea, "Include me in your lamentations," emphasise his suffering and pain at being a survivor. You can almost tell that he wishes he actually had died along with them, because his guilt torments and plagues him so much that he feels he should have died too. Then if you move on to your own personal response, you might want to say something along the lines of, "I feel that the poem expresses the speaker's personal and hellish experience of escaping the tragedy, the chaos and internal confusion he was made suffer as those around him condemned him for surviving when so many others died." Perhaps the most powerful or emotionally poignant part of the poem is the metaphor for drowning, as it emphasises his suffering and pain as a result of guilt. So, how would you actually come up with all of that in an exam? First of all, read the poem, read the question, underline your question terms and highlight them. Feel free to, as you're reading through your poem, highlight any words or phrases that stick out. So if you notice a metaphor, if you notice a simile, alliteration, sibilants, consonants, anything out of the ordinary that could be considered a poetic device, then highlight it. And if there aren't very many poetic devices, look at the more basic things such as, are there adjectives? What about the verb choice? What about the noun choice? And what do these things suggest as well? So think about imagery and language, not just on a more complex level, but also on a very basic level as well, because there's some easy marks available there. Think about the tones, so how should it be read out? Think about the form and structure, so how it looks on the page, and then get into the narrative point of view and whether it's first person or if it's third person. Very rarely will it be second. Think about the tense. Is there a reason for this? And you shouldn't just be randomly stating these things. Try to think, why is this being used? So obviously in this poem that we looked at, after the Titanic, we can see that the reason why it's only one stanza, why it's first person point of view, and why it's a soliloquy is all to emphasize the personal experience of the speaker and all the suffering that he has undergone. Also, don't forget to be thinking of really basic things like, what does the title tell me? Does it meet my expectations? Or does it not? For example, if you have something along the lines of Heaney's midterm break come up, it sounds like it's just going to be a poem about what somebody did during midterm break, but it ends up being quite tragically about the death of his younger brother. So always think, does the title meet my expectations? What is the poem about on a basic surface level? Is it about something on a more symbolic level? Form or structure, imagery and language, tone, theme, and then your own personal response to the poem as well. And if you follow that, if you know the names of all of those techniques, then you should be pretty good for this section, because you're not expected to have covered the poem before. It's completely unseen, a complete unknown entity. And good luck!